Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Joining me today is Michael Compton to talk about customer experience. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to be here.
So, for listeners who are hearing you for the very first time, can you explain a bit about who you are and what you do? I also like phrasing the question as, what is your superhero origin story?
So, I'm Michael Compton. I bring a background of both corporate work as well as entrepreneurship, and I'm applying that background with Denison University in an outreach hub, a professional center that they've started here in the Arena District of Columbus, Ohio, where we are training both the students of Denison and other affiliated universities through the Knowlton Career Center, as well as the professional community in the local area in different business literacies. What I began to, the reason I'm here in particular is that I created a program in collaboration with Denison University that I call the CX Innovation Lab, based on the premise that in today's business literacies should culminate in a superior customer experience. That all of the different literacies, whether it's product or service design, or content strategy, or systems architecture, or data strategies, even the way we finance innovation, all of that should be really measured by what kind of experience that we're wrapping our products and services in for customers. So the CX Innovation Lab is attempting to create about a 7-week, 9-to-5 immersive experience for participants. And we find ourselves interacting more with ecosystems than any one business, but it's a very interactive and actual experience. So you have the chaos of dealing with a lot of different stakeholders, and that's really part of the learning experience, is applying these technical literacies in human and community-centered context, and learning about engagement and cultural competency, as well as personal self-awareness, and how we process all of these different senses and experiences as business people. So that's what I do.
And I want to jump into all of that, but I'm curious to know, how did you get started working with nonprofits? Like, what is your history that led you up to working to where you are today?
So I was working in a similar capacity for the Columbus College of Art and Design, and they're a really wonderful, venerable institution here in the United States. And I kept finding wonderful opportunities to interact with communities that weren't the normal corporate clients. And while we extremely value those corporate partners, what I found was there was a really wonderful way to get to know the city, especially for the students. And so as I started trying to collaborate with different leaders in those communities around what we might call development, but which is really just entrepreneurship for the smaller entrepreneurs out of those communities, I started to realize there's a whole ecosystem of service providers that were that I didn't know about, and also a wonderfully cosmopolitan population here in Columbus, Ohio, that I was also ignorant about. And so I began really a long journey of like, wow, all of these competencies that I've developed over the years, they have new life in this arena. And I guess I became enchanted with this idea that this provides meaning for those of us who practice human-centered design in very human-centered contexts. And the nonprofit partners in Columbus are exceptionally collaborative and resourceful and entrepreneurial. And so it was really as much about my education as it was the students at the time. But I developed, and I saw that these institutions, the academic institutions, could provide sustainable services, become service providers, as it were, to the nonprofits. So as they're doing their services, we could provide services such as design, content, and whatnot. And so that began, a meaningful and productive relationship with the different nonprofits here. And it eventually led me overseas to the NGOs and those types of organizations as well.
Awesome. I'm actually UX certified as well as Salesforce, because UX I find is a fascinating element of the crossroads between human psychology and technology. So CX, or customer experience, is almost like a umbrella term or a higher level term than user experience. And I'm curious if you could define customer experience and how it differentiates from user experience.
I'm sure there's a taxonomy out there where we might say, there's user interface, and then there's user experience, and then there's service design, and then there's customer experience. But I'm also willing to accept that a lot of these things are interchangeable, only because sometimes you might find even a UI designer is responsible for a customer experience. I think for me, the idea of customer experience is probably the highest level. The way if I were to draw out draw these in circles and within each other, I think customer experience is the broadest way of capturing. And I would say customer experience has a lot of different ways of measuring it, so that we could define it by metrics. But the chief of those is, how do I feel about myself when I'm using your brand? And I think all the other metrics can support that one metrics, that I really feel good about myself as I'm buying or interacting with your company. But CX is attempting to quantify all those little discrete moments and across a litany of channels, both digital and physical, but so that they all culminate in this summative type of association with the brand. Like, I really like that brand, or I really don't like that brand. And a lot of that is, when we talk about customer experience, it's really a summation of all of these little moments that we've had with the brand, and whether or not they're good or bad or indifferent moments.
So it's a feeling, and I imagine that feeling comes from a range of experiences and or references from other people interacting with the brand. You mentioned physical and digital. So I'm curious then, how would nonprofits start thinking about building a good customer experience? Is there like a methodology to it? Is there a just some certain best practices? High level, we won't get too into the weeds here. The idea is just making sure that we have more concrete examples of how do you build a really good user experience.
Yeah, I would say there is a methodology. There's certainly a framework. It really begins with what, in a technical way, we might call it persona building and journey mapping. And the object of that is really to build empathy with the person that you're providing the service for. And I would just recommend every organization that is providing something to someone, if they haven't done it already, that they practice journey mapping their customers' experience with their organization. And that can begin even before the person knows that you exist. They have no awareness of you. So that you can begin to build empathy for what types of channels, the types of touch points, contacts that you might have with them to begin their relationship with your company. And then the persona is a lot like a character in a story. It's whereas a lot of public work the public tends to be represented in statistics and other abstractions, which are necessary to understand the size or scale of a need. In terms of providing a customer experience, those statistics are not as useful because, like you said, there's a subjective quality to experience, and there's cultural competency that has to come into play. So a journey map and a persona, both of those are helping us understand a character that we're serving. And it's a semi-fictional character. It's somewhat of a composite but the idea is that to make this as human as possible. She is 34 years old. She has a name. She is perhaps a diaspora from Kenya. You get into those kinds of specifics, and so that when you're thinking about what you're going to do for this person, you're thinking in very human terms. So the journey mapping, persona, and then the last thing you might do is, if you have a journey map, you might now talk about an operational framework. If you are doing interventions in that journey, you're providing an ideal or an improved journey to do a corresponding operational map or a service blueprint, so that you're able to then organize or align your team or your organization to care about those individual moments. Because a lot of times when we're providing our part to a service, we may not, inside of an organization, we may not know how we're contributing to the whole. We may not have ever thought about that. So if we all, let's say on a wall somewhere in a common space, we have a visualization of this map, we can see, okay, my lane is maybe back in the warehouse, or I'm coordinating resources for this person. Whatever my role is, I can begin to see how I contribute to this overall customer experience through mapping out these discrete moments.
So personas and journey mapping are actually two elements of user experience as well. So I'm pretty familiar with those. The third one, operational frameworking, that's actually pretty interesting, because now you're trying to find, if I understand correctly, services that will match the needs of the persona along the journey itself. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. And what we do here at the Innovation Lab is we culminate everything with a very common tool called a business model canvas. The beauty of that is it's commonly shared by a lot of different practitioners, but it also is an instructional tool. It helps us to consider what we're doing as a sustainable model. And then the operational map that you're talking about kind of refers to the left side of that business model canvas, where the journey mapping refers to more to the right side, where the customers live. And then if we design that operational template, it should be able to answer a lot of more basic assumptions about what sort of technology do we need for this moment, what sort of content do we need for this moment, what sort of activities do we need to be good at, what sort of resources do we need our hands on, and then what sort of partnerships will we need. Like, we can't do everything ourselves. And this just provides us a way of, when we say mapping them out, thinking about at this moment that we've journey mapped, how are we going to make that the optimal, and at this moment, and so forth. And then it also provides a basis for some itemization and profit and loss statements, because now we have at least a good sense. We start to work towards the cost structure that we sometimes call it at that point.
Just to go back to the personas and journey mapping, because I want to make sure we spend enough detail on that. So a persona, like you said, is a fictitious person, but with enough details that you can visualize them as an actual person. And in the user experience world, we do the same thing. Like I said, usually there's a handful of personas that we create, and they're trying to be different personas that don't really overlap too much. But these are the people and the stakeholders that you want to help. So for example, if you're a nonprofit, you might have a persona for a donor, or maybe more than one donor, maybe a major gift donor and a regular donor.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You might have volunteers, you might have caseworkers. So the idea is to identify the people or the types of people who will be interacting with your organization, defining a persona for them, and then being very specific so that you can, when you're talking about their needs and how they'll be interacting with your company, you can get very specific on details. And I'm curious to know, do you have any recommendations on how many personas to create? I mean, how level of detail should you get to? And how do you know that you've covered enough of your basis to say, yeah, we only need, let's say, 3 personas, because that covers all of or most of our use cases. We don't need to come up with 30 of them with every single permutation possible of every single interaction possible.
Yeah, it's a really good question for a couple of reasons, and especially today when we're rightfully concerned with diversity and inclusion and equity. And so, in some ways, there's an incentive to create a multiplicity of personas. Um, I and I actually think that's not a bad process to go through that, to start wide and to create a very inclusive list of personas. And as long as we are diligent in our the ability to make them real and not tropes, and I think as a UX designer and researcher yourself, you can understand what I'm saying. The and I think a lot of the nonprofits should be in an excellent position to know their constituency in such a way that they can create real characters that have empathy, because that's one of the objectives is to build empathy in the organization, um, and including the donors themselves. Um, so let's say we do have 30 unique personas because we care about the 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 complex diversity that's in our community, our constituency. I think from there, if we need to simplify things, we can find some commonalities, some universals to try to pare that down. Because at the end of the day, for design purposes, we we need a focus. As you know, as a designer, it's interesting. Like if we're building brand strategy, when it comes to design, now we're going to design an identity. We need to really boil down a lot of our brand strategy to a few traits, so that we know we're humorous, we're serious, right? We're smart, we're compassionate. Those types of traits become essential for design, so that it has a direction. And I think the same thing is with personas, is that I think it's perfectly fine to start wide and then to do some analysis and discussion and testing to say, can these, while we're being inclusive and mindful, can we at least categorize some of these personas into new personas that at least help us differentiate different levels of services, different products that we have, or different types of donors and partners that we have.
I think it's an excellent comment about inclusion. And I would go even one step further to say it's not just a matter of economic status or culture or gender, but it's also a matter of accessibility. If you're visually impaired or
Yeah.
hearing impaired, like these are considerations when you're designing different parts of your website or different parts of your experience, to keep those things in mind as well. And that's a whole nother layer, I guess, to add to the donor
Yeah.
volunteer level.
It's a beautiful comment, Alex, and you're absolutely right. And this is really a superpower of most nonprofits, is that they are actually, there's a bond, if you will, to some of the constituents. A lot of the nonprofit people that I talk to, they're people that they're working with are very human to them. And in a way, this is different than a lot of businesses. I'm not saying it's black and white, but a lot of businesses don't know their customers as well as they think they do. But nonprofits tend to have a very personal connection with people by a first name basis, even though they may be serving a large population. And I think that would really translate well into some very informative personas, including those with differentiations like what you're talking about, differently abled, even the invisible differences that sometimes get overlooked.
And then moving to journey mapping, just to make sure we also have a clear definition of what that is, because we kind of skipped over it, is the idea of understanding the points of contact that an individual has with the organization. And you said it could start even before they have their initial contact well, maybe you can talk more about how that happens before the initial contact. But the idea is that it's trying to map out the specific contact points that a organization may have with a person, and making sure that each of those happens in some kind of flow. Like, especially a use case I'll give is you fill out a form on the website. The user might give their email address. Now, with that email address, you know maybe a little bit about them, but not too much. So you might ask a survey question or various types of outreach emails. And based on whether the person opened the email or didn't open the email or clicked on a link or filled out a second survey, you might collect more information about that person. And then based on that, you got a decision point again to keep on nurturing that relationship up into the point that you want to either make them into a donor or a volunteer or some other way of having a deeper connection with the organization. So yeah, the comment, I guess the question to you is, how do you and can you plan for a journey before the initial contact? And is there anything that I mentioned in my sentence that you would add just to give it more color to what a journey map is or journey building?
Well, one of the challenges of journey mapping, it should be recognized, is that the time frame is very elastic. Like, we could create a journey map of buying a cup of coffee, or we could create a journey map of someone going to college for 4 years, or we could create one even beyond that, like maybe a relationship with a bank. So that creates some ambiguity. So we have to decide the time span that we want to map, and then the other thing is, it's easy for us to default to how they interact with our organization or our product or service. What I would recommend is starting with the broader experience, especially if we are trying to be relevant to their lived experience. So let me give you an example of, let's say we are providing housing assistance. So when someone is first experiencing vulnerability or insecurity with their rent, there are opportunities to intervene, but maybe our nonprofit doesn't intervene earlier. But nevertheless, we want to understand how many times they've been to the brink before they actually need our services. Because I think everybody would agree that's important to understand the emotional state and the social state of the constituents. So we may even begin with some of the early indicators of housing insecurity, and then we may start with the first time they get a notice on their door, they're late, and we may try to understand how they're talking to their landlords, if we're indeed talking about rent, or how they're talking to their banks, if they're mortgage holders. So, and all of the different interventions, how many times did they have to get notices on their door? And are they searching the internet for help? And is it difficult or easy for them to find assistance? Do they even know that there's assistance? It's difficult to map all of these out, but it's still possible to build some sort of fidelity around these moments in their lives, so that if we continue the journey map, eventually they could end up in, let's say, eviction court, if they take it that far. So as we're mapping these steps out, we may find that we have 12 or 15 or even more, and they may not capture all of the true human experience, and yet they capture quite a bit to help not only the planners but everyone else in the organization to have a shared visibility of this lived experience. And not that it is going to tell all the story, but that if, let's say, we are the people working in, let's say, eviction court, maybe we're a nonprofit that is concerned with providing intervention and avoiding that eviction. And of course, we know about this earlier steps in their journey, but perhaps not everybody in the organization fully understands that before they get to us, there's perhaps months of trauma and months of suspense and maybe unnecessary decisions that were made. And we may have started thinking, well, we're going to provide help at this point, but maybe now is it possible to go to an earlier point of intervention? Even if our channel is the downtown courthouse, maybe there's another channel that we should be considering, another way of intervening even before they reach the eviction court stage. So anyways, I guess my point in that is as we think about where we fit in their lives, we're going to get smarter about our value and our services, rather than thinking about how they fit in our service, how they will. If we start with just how they interact with us, we may be limiting our imagination about the possibilities that we could offer them.
In terms of the different kinds of channels, because there are physical channels and digital channels, as an organization is building their brand, as they're building their customer experience, how many different channels or is there a limit or a consideration for how many channels an organization should support? Like, obviously, physical is going to be an important one for people providing shelter and certain digital channels, but there's just a lot of choice out there. Any recommendations, best practices, or comments about how many channels an organization should support and monitor and provide for? Maybe a starting point, and then you grow from there, or you explore to see what works, what doesn't work, and roll them back, the ones that don't work. Any comments about the number of channels that an organization should support?
Well, if we've put a lot of work into the persona building and the journey mapping, hopefully what we've arrived at is an understanding of where it's best to meet them. I mean, that's the whole point of channels. We hear a lot today about this omni-channel, where we're mixing every channel possible into a blended, seamless experience. But in reality, certain products and services are going to be, customers are going to want to access those services in some ways more than others. So I feel like the first place to begin with is when we're doing that picture building of who our customer is and how they go about meeting their own needs. That should help inform us, ideally, where the channels be. We may not be able to create channels. Oh, and by the way, I think it's worth saying channel is a word that we use for how we meet the customer. So a store is a channel. Your mobile phone is a channel, if you know. Alexa or Google Voice can be a channel. If I'm in my house and I can access your service through Alexa, that's a channel. And what we want to do is to find out which channels ideally best serve the customer. During the pandemic, I like to say that the couch, the sofa became a channel, and those companies that were best able to serve people from that couch, that became a competitive advantage. So obviously I'm talking about maybe a mobile phone or a tablet or something. But if we're assuming that people want to come down to our center or our food pantry or our location, and we haven't spent time knowing, okay, what we've just created another job for them, for instance, now they have to get transportation. And I'm being very obvious here because I think most people understand the contradiction there. So the selection of channels really depends on what we've learned from the journey mapping. And I think that also ties into the relationship style. Is this a self-help experience? Because in some cases that's preferable. Or is this a concierge type experience where somebody's going to be with me while I'm receiving this service? So those, the relationship style and the channel are really, they're sort of interactive considerations.
Yeah, I imagine some people under certain conditions will prefer to have self-help where they can go on their phone, on their couch, look up the
Yeah.
resources that they need and get access to it, versus some people just need that hand holding. They need to be in front of a person that they can hold and hug to get that kind of support.
Well said. Yep.
And then even at the digital level channel, if we just took a look at the phone or your tablet or your laptop, I mean, you have potentially hundreds of channels within there based on if you're working on social media versus your own app versus a website on your, any considerations there. Like, I hope that most nonprofits at this point have at least a website where you can interact to some extent, whether it's, consuming information, maybe submitting a form of some kind. But is there any other, you don't want the nonprofit to also overreach in that providing, dozens of channels across all social media only for them to interact with only one or two. So any considerations for where in the digital space organizations should start and where they should consider moving to next in terms of channels?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that I think touches on the difference between businesses and nonprofits, where if I can create a mutually exclusive channel, then as a business owner, I'm winning. But in the nonprofit space, that may not be ideal for the persona that we're designing for. So you mentioned about all the possibilities. We can all have websites. We can even have apps. But in terms of customer experience, there's a conundrum starts to emerge, and that is we become resource rich but coordination poor. And so to me, that's a perennial problem, a challenge, I should say, that most nonprofits are very, very familiar with. How can we create channels that serve where we are not competing as businesses, but we are creating coordinated channels that are improving that customer experience in a way that we as individual nonprofits or organizations can't do, but in the process increase our own visibility. Is I think a lot of the questions that are going on right now regarding communication, coordination, are essential to this conversation around customer experience and channel management in the nonprofit world.
Yeah, I really like that idea of whatever channels you do create, they should be resource rich. I like that idea. It gives a nice visualization that
Yes.
you're not spreading yourself thin. You want to be able to you can coordinate across the channels that make sense and don't overextend yourself because then you're not serving the needs anymore of your community.
Hmm.
For organizations who are looking at this for the first time, let's say they're onboarded, like they like the idea of a customer experience, but creating personas, creating customer mapping, doing this operational framework, practice makes perfect. And for those maybe who are a bit beginner, who are not sure where to begin, would you suggest either hiring an outside firm to help for them to copy an existing model that they think exists, like another nonprofit or another for-profit company that has a pretty good customer experience, or other means to be able to start creating and delivering on this customer experience?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Obviously, you could hire a facilitator to guide a team through that. And there's nothing wrong at all about that. It's a great idea. The challenge that I find with workshops, for instance, if we were to conduct a workshop, is that we're merely teaching a methodology. There has to be a deeper commitment, a cultural alignment, if you will, within the organization towards journey mapping, because it's not a workshop exercise. So facilitating that, but yet at the same time not creating an expensive consultancy, does become a challenge. One of the things that we've done here at the CX Innovation Lab to address that is to create paper tools, not digital tools, but paper tools that afford a co-creation experience, so that your journey mapping exercises are, you can actually do them in collaboration with different people from your community. They can participate in, it's almost hopefully autobiographical is what I'm saying. And these paper tools are they're structured in such a way they provide frameworks for how to talk about each moment in a way that's productive and meaningful, and you're building information. But I do see it as akin almost to a research project if done right. Not to make it forbidding or seem like, oh no, that's too big of a mountain for us to climb, which is something I understand. And that's why I think you start with perhaps that facilitation to learn the methodology, but you view it as an ongoing engagement with your constituents. And then you try to make it as much a co-creation process as possible. And the reason we use a lot of paper products is that when you invite people to a table, it's a lot easier to pick up a pencil and write your thoughts into the right boxes, so to speak, on a journey map moment, so that it's no longer the practice of a professional practitioner, but you're in a way doing a lot of open-ended interaction with people that you can then later sequence into something that begins to resemble a meaningful story. So I hope I'm communicating that it's an ongoing opportunity for conversation and engagement with people.
On a note on the label of people, because I know that labels now these days have a deeper meaning and you can create a good connection with people when you use the right label.
Yes.
And there's a bunch of words we've been using even in this podcast: constituent. We talk about customers. Sometimes people, we call them as stakeholders or clients, communities. And each of these words have a slightly different meaning. I mean, they're almost interchangeable to a certain extent. But is there any, from a customer experience perspective, is there any um, recommendation or advantage to using one word over another, or they're all pretty much the same and it's just based on your personal preference?
Um, yeah, I think you've raised a very good point, especially when dealing with what we might label, as you use that word, as vulnerable, but also just as often disenfranchised. And so if we call people that really have been or do feel disenfranchised, if we call them stakeholders, we're in a way, paving over the reality of the situation. So I believe those labels are important, and we should be sensitive about them. And even the label of customer is not flawless. As much as I would like to, I love the idea that viewing people who are receiving different services as customers, in that we care about them and want to give them a good experience. And even though we have this facility here called the Customer Experience Innovation Lab, I would even say that the word customer is not perfect and flawless. It has some inherent problems.
Yeah, it's tricky. I had a client, for example, who, because Salesforce is a CRM and that's what we're delivering as part of a digital transformation, they didn't really want to use the word customer relationship management. They felt the word customer was not quite representative, even though it
Mm-hmm.
might apply to some of their actual people that they connect with. It's not inclusive. So contact management is also another one that comes up. That's even less personal. So yeah, these labels, they do mean, they do have different meanings to different people. So it is tricky to find the right one, and it might be a combination of those words that might be the right choice, because customers seem more like a store customer. A client seems more like a business client. So I've heard actually
Right.
in the Salesforce world, they prefer, or they're now advocating for the word stakeholder. This is a person that has a stake in the organization that you are. That's actually their preferred word at this point. Whether it's the right or not, it's just something they came up with recently.
Sure. It's a yeah. No. Yeah. I definitely understand it. It arose with even around corporate responsibility to recognize that between the shareholders and the customers, there are a lot of people affected by our business economically, ecologically, and so forth. And so I think the intention to use that word stakeholders was good intentions to understand that businesses are sitting inside of civic economies that they're impacting. And I think maybe it's just a good practice to recognize when we use words, they're just words. And we're doing our best we're doing our best, and we're willing to swap out words at a moment's notice if we begin to learn they're starting to shift in their meaning. And of course, we've done that with other words as well. On that idea of customers, is that sometimes the customer is so much of their community that we could even begin to talk about community experience with certain services or agencies. And there's a lot of community response to certain services or agencies. So it wouldn't be very avant-garde at all to say that CX means community experience.
I agree, actually. And I would then ask the question of, should an organization consider more the individual or the community, or I guess both? There must be some kind of priority that you can put on one over the other, or maybe you shouldn't, and everybody should be included in both the customer experience and the community experience. How would you separate, if you need to separate at all, customers from communities?
Yeah, at this point, I would be somewhat philosophizing about that, but my attempt to do that would be, if the reputation and if the influence of my organization is going to be discussed at a community level, then at least I know I should be thinking about community experience. And is there a way to engage? Is there a channel that allows me to engage the community as the community? I mean, obviously, every customer from a certain zip code is going to be part of that community. But is there a way I can provide a community experience in a way that's it's physically clear that we're engaging as a community? So I think, in the most basic sense, that's where I would begin. Is this am I experiencing this as an individual, and then I'm going to go and maybe chat with my friends? Well, that could be a community experience, but I'm still interacting with an individual on their own private matters. But am I interacting with a community about something that they all share, the same story? Another way of maybe deciding, am I dealing with a community or a customer or an individual, is I like to say, when we share the same stories, then we're a community. So if my story, like let's say you're helping me with something that's very private and it's my story, then then it's okay if I'm a customer. Again, that word has problems, but it's okay. But if we're talking about a shared story, a story that I don't mind identifying with other people openly, then we may be dealing with a community experience at that point.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I totally agree. Shifting gears to the future and actually maybe even the present, the buzzword of the month, certainly the quarter, is AI. And I'm curious to know how, from your perspective, how AI fits in the whole customer or community experience.
My position is that it's undoubtedly relevant and important. If we look beyond ChatGPT and the impact it's had, if we look at what the underlying technology is doing, and that is taking different modalities of media, not just text, but video, sound, pictures, and turning them into common vector databases that can provide unexpected correlations with one another. It's the so-called multimodal generative AI. The world is definitely going to be changing in the next 5 years with such a technology. And already we've seen that search itself, one of our most fundamental customer experiences, is being challenged by the generative capabilities of like ChatGPT or Midjourney, and so much so that I would say we could call it a generative search. So the implications for things like coordination, for instance, where now perhaps assistants are almost, it's like an Easter egg hunt. I'm trying to fill my basket with enough pieces of assistance, and I'm searching high and low through the nooks and crannies of my city to find this assistance. The potential with generative AI to turn that around and to create a customer experience guidance that is unparalleled is right before us. Now, how we coordinate that and who shares data and who contributes to that's a whole nother question. But the technology certainly exists to start having conversations with the entire ecosystem as an AI, as it were. On a practical level, so first of all, I think we should start to anticipate that searching for resources can get tremendously easier. We should anticipate that there will be people who figure that out, and communities and ecosystems that are able to collaborate and point the way to that. On a practical level, the way I would approach it is, if you have the bandwidth in your organization to start experimenting with one of the APIs, just to understand the promise and the peril of working with AI. There is peril, there are pitfalls without a doubt. In a second, we can talk about the bigger issue of safety and alignment. But putting that aside for a second, playing with the APIs, you can do some very low tech things right away without even understanding how them are working. There are ways to use your own data, your organization's data, for instance, and add them to the tremendous conversational capabilities of ChatGPT. In just relatively a day or two, it's possible to put together a prototype just to see how people might like conversing with the sum total knowledge of your organization in a conversational way. And then beyond that, there's additional ways of augmenting the AI models. And then for some of the larger national nonprofits, there are ways of even fine tuning the models. But the first thing to do is to realize it's very easy to do low level experiments with your own data and very contained pilots to see how people might like interacting with a conversational AI.
There is a lot we can talk about AI. I mean, this could be a whole conversation in itself in terms of customer experience. So I'm happy we kind of broach the topic, but I think I might just ask the one question that I really want to ask. A lot of use cases that I've seen, at least, is having ChatGPT or something like it write emails or newsletters on behalf of an organization. And I'm curious to know, in doing so, should an organization feel or that they're kind of dehumanizing our relationship with our customers, in the sense that if I'm getting an AI to write the paragraph for me, the human element and maybe the emotional element is may or may not be there, or at least not the way that I would have done it if I had written it myself. And I'm curious to know that as we're using AI, because I think it's a tool that we can all leverage and we should leverage, and there's a lot of power to it. How do we balance that with staying human, with building that empathy that we talked about earlier, and all these various touch points? Is it something we should be concerned about, or it's just a tool and making sure we maybe tweak the results that the ChatGPT algorithm gives us? How do we basically keep it human while leveraging AI?
So from the customer facing standpoint, let's say we did create an AI that is offering customer service. The early research indicates that customers really like it, even in healthcare related domains. And my speculation as to why that is that you're going to get best practice answers, and you can get them at 2 a.m. and the AI is trained to be very polite. Is it always factual and whatnot is another discussion. But as far as humanizing customer experience at scale, AI looks like it's very promising for doing that. On the other hand, you were talking about internal communications. If I'm writing a letter to you, like I think right now we're probably starting to get suspicious. Am I reading AI right now? Right? I don't want to receive a letter written to me by a computer that wasn't, but yet it's pretending to be very human. I don't know if there's any way to avoid that. We just currently live under such production demands, and certainly within nonprofit services and public services, a lot of people are besieged with paperwork and reporting for audits. It's never ending. So I can I can empathize if somebody found a way to use ChatGPT to allow them to go home, at 6 p.m. instead of 8 p.m. I can hardly fault them. The system is so orientated. A lot of our systems are so orientated towards production. I don't know if there's a clean answer for that. I like your idea of using ChatGPT to do the initial lifting and then going through it and making sure that I've edited it. I will say ChatGPT can standardize and make sure that I've not, at the end of the weekend or something like that, at the end of the week, I've gotten tired, I've gotten sloppy. It does have some quality assurance promise. Oh, and one more tip I could add to that. If I have to write a certain number of letters or certain kinds of letters, thanking donors, for instance, or asking people to come in, we can better serve you if you come in and sit down and talk with us. And if I know I'm having to send those letters out, what we can do, and this is a mild form of alignment of the AI with our values as an organization, is that we can create prompts for the AI that are rooted or based on frameworks about how we believe the letter should be written. So there's no need to say, just write me a letter, make it sound caring, but rather provide a detailed instructions and use that prompt across the board so that it's very detailed in how it's saying, can you write a letter to the donor and address this, if indeed we must use AI in those capacities. So one way we can get some control of that generative output is by using prompts, maybe even pre-approved prompts across the organization that are on one hand going to help us with writing so much or reporting so much, but on the other hand have some sort of brand standards, right, for what that output will look like, and some sort of human standards as well.
Love it. And I love that example of the chatbot. If someone wants to get questions or answers at 2 a.m., the chatbot can do it. And if it's AI empowered,
right.
Even better. There's a lot more we can talk about. I know we need to I want to respect your time today. So this has been great. Thank you so much for joining me, Michael. Where can people find more about you online, get in touch if there's any follow-up questions they may have?
Well, the CX Innovation Lab is searchable, especially if you link it with Denison University. So that's one way. And then I'm on LinkedIn as Michael Compton. I don't mind giving my email address and my private email. It's just straight out. It's str8outa@gmail.com.
Awesome. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today.
It was my pleasure, Alex. That's really an interesting conversation for sure.
Definitely. All right, that's it for today. I am Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.